It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed. A crisp breeze rustled through the trees, the sun hanging high, casting its warm glow over the landscape. But little did anyone know, in the quiet town where this story unfolds, something extraordinary was about to happen. It wasn't the kind of adventure that starts with a map or treasure chest. No, this adventure began with a single dog, full of energy and curiosity, just like any other dog. But what happened next was far from ordinary. What this dog uncovered that day would change everything, and it all started with a buried secret, just waiting to be found. It was an early morning walk when the dog, always eager to explore, veered off the familiar path and wandered deeper into the woods. His owner, calling out in mild frustration, didn't expect this detour to be anything other than another typical, uneventful day. But the dog was onto something. His nose twitched, and his paws began to dig eagerly into the earth, as if something was calling to him beneath the soil. It wasn't a stick, it wasn't a squirrel, and it wasn't a bone. No, this was different. The ground was soft, and the scent was unusual. Something strange had been hidden here, and now, the dog had found it. As he continued to dig, the hole grew larger, and his excitement grew, too. The ground gave way with a sudden shift, revealing a small, rusted metal object. The dog, hardly understanding the significance of what he just unearthed, pawed at it with even more enthusiasm. His owner rushed over, eyes wide with surprise. What was that? A piece of old machinery? Some forgotten relic? The metal seemed old, covered in grime and dirt. But something about it made the air feel charged, as if this object had been waiting for years, maybe even centuries, for someone to find it. The owner knelt down, dusting off the dirt. There was something etched into the metal. Was it a map? An inscription? It was too hard to make out at first, but one thing was certain, this wasn't just trash. The discovery raised more questions than answers. How did this end up here? What was it? And most importantly, what was its purpose? The dog, still sniffing around excitedly, seemed to know more than his human. His behavior had shifted from playful to focused. His tail wagged in anticipation, and his eyes darted around, as if waiting for something to happen. The owner, now fully intrigued, inspected the object further, trying to decipher the symbols or markings that had been etched into it. But the more they looked, the more they realized that this was only the beginning. What lay ahead would take them on a journey either of them could have ever imagined. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the land, a sudden chill filled the air. A strange sensation lingered. The dog's bark echoed through the woods, and as if on cue, something shifted in the atmosphere. A distant rumble of thunder rolled in the background, though the skies were clear moments before. The earth seemed to tremble slightly underfoot. Was it just a storm coming, or was something far more mysterious at work? And then, as the dog stood there, looking at the object with intensity, his eyes locked onto something in the distance. A shape. A figure, perhaps? It was hard to say, but it was enough to send a shiver down the spine. The air thickened with tension. The owner felt it too now. They weren't alone. But who or what was watching them from the shadows of the trees? The dog's growl broke the silence, a low, warning sound that sent a ripple of unease through the woods. The mysterious figure, if that's what it was, remained motionless, like a presence waiting to be discovered. What was going on here? What had the dog found? And why did it seem like someone or something was ready to make a move? The unease in the air was palpable, and as the dog's growl grew louder, the questions only multiplied. Was there more hidden in these woods? Was this treasure really just a treasure, or was it something darker, something tied to a story long buried in the past? The answers, though, wouldn't come so easily. The dog was just beginning to scratch the surface of a mystery that spanned far beyond the woods. The road ahead would be full of twists and turns, and the adventure was only just beginning. But the deeper they went, the more the danger grew. Would they uncover the truth, or would they become part of the mystery themselves? As the sun set, casting the woods in an eerie twilight, the dogs stood poised and ready, eyes locked on whatever lay ahead. The treasure was only the start. The adventure that followed would take them into the heart of a mystery that threatened to change everything. And the only way to find out what happens next is to keep watching. Because what comes next? Well, that's something you'll have to see for yourself. The evening air grew heavier, and the dog, still fixated on the shadowy figure in the distance, stood perfectly still, his body tense. His eyes, wide and unwavering, followed the movement of someone just beyond the reach of the fading light. The owner, still on the ground, heart pounding in their chest, couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just out for a walk anymore. This was different. Something had changed, and they were no longer alone in these woods. For a moment, everything stood still. The rustling leaves. The distant calls of night creatures. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. The only sound now was the low growl from the dog, a steady, unrelenting warning. The owner felt the weight of it, the sense of foreboding thickening with every passing second. "Easy, boy," the owner murmured, trying to reassure both the dog and themselves, though they could hardly believe their own words. What was this? Had they wandered into the wrong part of the forest? Was this place cursed? They shook their head, attempting to rationalize it. It had to be a trick of the light. The shadow they saw may be a figment of their imagination. But the dog wasn't acting like it. The animal's instincts were sharp, alert. He knew something was out there. And the owner couldn't ignore that. The rustling again. This time, it was closer. The dog's growl deepened, and his tail bristled with tension. The owner's pulse quickened. With one hand still gripping the strange, rusted object they'd uncovered, they slowly rose to their feet, glancing around nervously. Their eyes scanned the darkening forest, but there was no sign of the figure, just the darkening trees, the looming shadows. There was something unsettling about this place, the very ground beneath their feet, the trees that seemed to stand taller in the quiet of the evening. The dog, however, wasn't waiting. He turned and began to trot in the direction of the rustling, his nose sniffing the air as he went, his tail held high in determination. The owner hesitated, unsure if they should follow. Every instinct told them to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But something about the mystery, the strange pull of the object in their hand, something deep inside them compelled them to move forward. They followed the dog through the thickening darkness, the canopy of trees above them blocking out more and more of the fading light. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder. A dampness settled over everything, as if the ground itself were soaked in secrets. The dog trotted ahead, his paws making little noise on the forest floor. But the silence around them was heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The rustling had stopped, but now there was an eerie quiet that filled the space between every breath. The owner couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as if the forest itself had come alive with eyes, every tree, every rustling leaf, every breeze holding its own secret. The dog, however, showed no signs of fear, his movements steady and confident. He was leading them somewhere, guiding them as though he knew exactly what he was doing. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. The trees opened up to reveal a small, abandoned cabin, half hidden behind a thick veil of vines and overgrown foliage. It looked ancient, as if it had been standing for decades, untouched by time. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, barely hanging on, and the windows were dark and empty, the glass long gone. It was the kind of place you would expect to see in a ghost story, a place that held the weight of years, maybe centuries, of forgotten history. The dog stopped at the edge of the clearing, his body frozen as he stared at the cabin. The air felt different here. charged, as if something powerful had once lived in this space or perhaps still did. The owner stood there, hesitant, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on them. This wasn't a coincidence. This place, this cabin, it had to be connected to the strange object the dog had uncovered. But how? And why did it feel so wrong? A sudden chill swept through the clearing, raising goosebumps on the owner's arms. The dog's growl broke the silence again, sharper this time, more insistent. The owner looked down at the dog, who was now standing rigid, his gaze still fixed on the cabin. A shiver ran down their spine. They took a step forward, then another. The dog stayed close, his presence a small comfort in the growing uncertainty. As they approached the cabin, the door creaked open slightly, as though inviting them in or warning them away. The owner hesitated. The sense of danger was real now, more intense than ever. But the desire to uncover the truth, to find out what this was all about, was stronger. With one final look at the dog, the owner stepped toward the cabin, pushing the door open just enough to squeeze inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and forgotten memories. The light from outside barely penetrated the darkness inside, but enough filtered through to reveal a room full of cobwebs and old furniture, covered in dust. In the center of the room, something gleamed. The dog moved toward it without hesitation, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the ground. The owner's heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be happening. Was this what they had been looking for? They knelt down beside the dog, eyes following the animal's path. What lay before them was another object, but this one was different, its surface smoother, its design more intricate, almost beautiful. It was another piece of metal, but this one looked deliberate, carefully crafted, almost ceremonial. The owner reached out and touched the object. It felt warm, as if it had just been placed there. As their fingers brushed the surface, a sudden jolt of energy surged through them, sending a shock through their body. They yanked their hand back in surprise, eyes wide with alarm. The dog barked sharply, as if warning them of something. What had just happened? The energy was unmistakable, something ancient, something alive. But what? And why did it feel like they had just unlocked something they shouldn't have? A loud creak echoed from somewhere deep within the cabin, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, rang out. The owner's heart raced. Who was there? They weren't alone. The dog barked again, this time a full, aggressive growl that reverberated through the room. The footsteps stopped, but the air was thick with tension. The presence of someone was now undeniable. The dog backed up slightly, his hackles raised, and the owner felt their pulse quicken. Who's there? The owner called out, their voice barely more than a whisper. But there was no answer, just a heavy silence pressing down on them. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. Then, out of the corner of their eye, the owner saw movement, a shadow, just at the edge of the room. They turned toward it quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the faintest trace of something moving in the dark, like a figure that had melted into the shadows. The dog's growl deepened, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken. The owner backed away slowly, eyes darting around the room. There was something in here, something they hadn't seen, something that had been hidden in the dark corners of this cabin. They could feel it now, the danger rising with every breath. They weren't sure what was happening, but one thing was clear, they had stepped into something far bigger than they could ever have imagined. The object they had uncovered, the dog's strange behavior, the eerie presence in the cabin, all of it pointed to one thing: this was no ordinary treasure hunt. There was something else at work here, something ancient and powerful. And they had just scratched the surface. But what was it? What had they uncovered, and why was it so important? And more importantly, who or what was following them? The answers weren't coming easily, and the deeper they went, the more the mystery unfolded, layer by layer. But one thing was certain, the adventure was far from over. It was only just beginning. The silence in the cabin was deafening, each passing moment stretching into what felt like an eternity. The owner's heart pounded in their chest, their breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows seemed to shift, ever so slightly, in the corners of the room. The air was thick, as if the very atmosphere around them was charged with an ancient energy. The dog's growl intensified, low and menacing, and the owner instinctively took a step back, instinctively pulling the rusted metal object closer to their chest, as though it could offer them some kind of protection. The footsteps that had stopped earlier began again, but this time, they were slow and deliberate. Each step echoed with the weight of something old, something ominous. It wasn't just a person. No, this presence, this sound, felt different. More like something ancient, something tied to the earth itself. The owner's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had they disturbed something? Had they triggered a hidden force, one that had been dormant for years, maybe centuries? The dog suddenly bolted forward, barking wildly as he lunged toward the darkened corner of the room. The owner shouted, grabbing at the dog's collar to pull him back, but it was too late. The shadow that had been flickering in the corner of the room now surged forward with alarming speed, materializing into something far more solid. A figure. Tall, cloaked in darkness, with no discernible features other than the eerie glow that emanated from within the folds of the cloak. The figure was still, almost statue-like, but there was no mistaking the sense of malevolence that hung in the air. The dog, now trembling, stood frozen in front of the figure, still growling, but there was no certainty in his stance anymore. The energy in the room shifted, and it was as if everything held its breath. "Who are you?" The owner managed to croak, their voice tight with fear. The figure did not respond. Instead, it raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at the object in the owner's hand. The owner's fingers tightened around the metal, their mind racing with a million questions. What was it? Why had they found it? What did it have to do with this strange figure? The cold sensation of dread crept up their spine as they realized that they were no longer in control of the situation. The figure stepped closer, its movement unnervingly smooth and silent. The dog, once so fierce, now backed away, tail tucked between his legs, his growl turning to a whimper. The figure's eyes, though they were hidden beneath the hood, felt like they were burning through the darkness, boring into the owner's soul. "I'm not afraid of you," the owner said, though their voice quivered, betraying them. They took another step back, the cold floor creaking under their boots. But their hands still gripped the metal object, a lifeline in a room that had suddenly become far too small, far too dark. The figure's lips parted, and though no sound escaped, the owner felt the words, as if they were spoken directly into their mind. "You've awakened something that should have remained buried." The words echoed in the room, reverberating through the air like an ancient warning, a threat that seemed to vibrate in the bones of the cabin itself. The figure raised both hands now, and the shadows around them began to pulse, shifting in a way that felt unnatural. The dog, now beside the owner, let out a low whine, pawing at the ground nervously. The owner was paralyzed. It was clear that whatever they had uncovered, whatever was hidden in this cursed cabin, was far beyond their understanding. They had hoped for an adventure, a mystery to solve, but now they were beginning to realize that they had stumbled into something that could never be fully understood by mere mortals. This was bigger than they had imagined, much bigger. The figure took another step forward, and for the first time, the owner noticed a faint symbol etched into the stone wall behind it, hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. The symbol was unlike anything they had ever seen, intricate and ancient, almost alive in its own right. The metal object they had found earlier seemed to pulse in their hand, almost as though it were reacting to the presence of the figure, to the symbol. It was then that the owner understood this was no ordinary treasure. This wasn't a relic lost to time. It was a key to something far older, far darker than they had ever realized. The figure spoke again, its voice now faint but clearer, like a whisper carried on the wind. You will not leave here with it. It is not yours to claim. The air grew colder, the shadows around them deeper. The dog, now standing at attention beside the owner, let out a sharp bark and lunged forward, but the figure merely raised a hand, and the dog froze in place, as if held by some invisible force. The owner's heart raced. They had to do something. This figure, whatever it was, wasn't going to let them leave. The treasure they had found was far more dangerous than they had imagined. With trembling hands, the owner glanced around the cabin, looking for anything that could help. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing thicker, heavier, as though the very space around them was alive, aware of their every movement. The object in their hand pulsed again, and the owner knew, with a sudden certainty, that the object was tied to the figure, tied to the darkness in this cabin. Without thinking, they thrust the object toward the figure, as if offering it, hoping that some part of the ancient force would recognize the gesture. The figure paused, and for a moment, the room fell into complete silence. Then, slowly, it stepped forward, reaching out with both hands. The shadows seemed to gather around it, swirling like a storm as it drew closer. The dog, who had been frozen in place, now whined and struggled against the invisible force holding him. The owner's pulse quickened. The figure was closer now, its presence overwhelming, and the shadows around them seemed to press in tighter. It was as if the entire world had narrowed down to this one single moment, this one decision. The figure reached for the object, its cold, invisible fingers brushing against the owner's. And for a fleeting second, everything stopped. The world held its breath. But just as quickly, everything shattered. A burst of light erupted from the object, blinding and fierce, sending a shockwave through the cabin. The figure recoiled, its form faltering, as if it were being torn apart by the sudden force. The owner stumbled back, their hands instinctively shielding their eyes from the searing brightness. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the light faded. The cabin fell into an eerie silence once again. The figure was gone. The shadows remained, lingering like ghosts, but there was no sign of the cloaked figure that had filled the room moments before. The dog, now free from whatever had held him, darted to the owner's side, his fur standing on end. The owner's breath came in ragged gasps, their hearts still pounding. What had just happened? Had they driven the figure away? Or had they merely made it angrier? There were no answers, only the lingering sense of dread. The object in their hands still pulsed faintly, as if it were waiting for something, as if it were still tied to the dark forces that had emerged in the cabin. The owner stood frozen, every muscle tense, eyes scanning the empty room, still unsure if the danger had passed or if it was only just beginning. Whatever had been awakened, whatever ancient force had been disturbed, was still out there. And the owner knew, with growing certainty, that they would not be able to escape it. Not until the full truth was uncovered. Not until the treasure, whatever it truly was understood. And so, with the dog by their side, the owner made their way back into the darkness, unsure of what lay ahead. But one thing was certain, the adventure had just begun. The air felt colder now, the silence heavier. As the owner and the dog stood at the threshold of the cabin, the shadows seemed to shift again, as though the world itself was still in motion, adjusting to the intrusion they had caused. Every step they took away from the cabin seemed to carry a heavier weight, a burden they couldn't shake. The object, still tightly clutched in the owner's hand, pulsed once more, faintly at first, then growing more intense with each passing moment. It was as if it were calling out, responding to something far away, something that had been waiting for this exact moment. The dog, usually so confident and sure of himself, now walked with his tail between his legs, his steps cautious. His senses were alert, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. The owner's pulse was in their throat, every nerve screaming that they weren't alone. They weren't just walking out of the cabin. They were being followed. The forest around them felt different now. Darker, more oppressive. The trees seemed to stretch higher, their limbs twisting into unnatural shapes, their shadows long and ominous. The familiar path they had once known felt foreign, as if the forest itself had shifted, the way ahead obscured. The owner's feet moved almost instinctively, but every step felt like it was leading them deeper into something they didn't understand. They tried to keep their focus, but the feeling of being watched never left, crawling at the back of their neck, itching under their skin. Suddenly, the dog stopped, frozen in place. His body was rigid, his head low, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The owner's breath caught in their throat. There it was again. That sound, the unmistakable heavy footsteps in the distance, slow and deliberate, just like before. The figure. The owner's hand tightened around the object, its pulse growing faster now, almost frantic. Whatever had been disturbed in that cabin was not done with them. Whatever ancient force had been unleashed was not going to let them leave so easily. Without a word, the dog started to move again, but this time, his pace quickened, a sense of urgency in every step. The owner followed, but their mind was racing. They had to get away. They had to escape this place, this cursed forest, this nightmare that had grown far beyond their control. But the deeper they went, the more the feeling of dread built. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows growing longer with every step they took. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence apart from the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch was deafening. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The dog's steps became more frantic, and the owner's heart started to pound harder, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. There was no denying it now, something was closing in. Something was watching. The footsteps were unmistakable, growing louder with every passing second. The dog turned sharply, leading the owner toward a narrow, overgrown path they hadn't noticed before. It was hidden between two large, twisted trees, their gnarled roots snaking out like dark fingers, gripping the earth. The air was colder here, the atmosphere more oppressive. The owner stumbled, their boots catching on the uneven ground as they tried to keep up with the dog. They couldn't stop now. They couldn't look back. But that feeling, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on them, grew stronger, more intense. Every instinct told them that something was drawing nearer, closing in like a storm, and they weren't sure they were going to outrun it. The rustling of the leaves became more erratic, almost frantic, as though something was pushing through the underbrush. The dog growled low, his hackles raised, his body tense. The owner's breath hitched. They could hear it now, unmistakable, a figure moving swiftly behind them, its footsteps echoing with unnatural clarity. A sudden flash of light pierced through the trees, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The owner froze, eyes wide. It was coming closer. The dog barked, a sharp, high-pitched sound that shattered the tension, and with that, the owner turned. But there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, no sign of movement. Just the darkness of the forest stretching out before them. The only sound now was their own rapid breathing, their heart pounding in their chest. Was it just their imagination? Was it the fear playing tricks on them? But as they stood there, uncertain, a loud crack of branches echoed behind them, followed by the unmistakable growl of the dog. The figure was real. It was still coming. And it was closer than ever. The owner snapped back into motion, their feet moving faster now, their heart racing in their chest. They pushed through the trees, ignoring the sharp branches that reached out to claw at them, their eyes fixed on the path ahead. But the sound of the footsteps grew louder. Closer. The figure wasn't just following them, it was gaining ground. The very air seemed to shimmer, as if the forest itself was folding in on them. The dog let out another sharp bark, more desperate now. The owner's eyes flicked to the side, searching for any sign of safety. But all they saw were shadows, endless, oppressive shadows, swallowing the light. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't hide from it. The only option was to confront whatever this was, whatever ancient force had been awakened in the forest. They reached a clearing, and for a brief moment, there was a sense of relief. The trees parted just enough to let a sliver of moonlight cut through, illuminating the space. But the moment of respite was short-lived. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the air growing thick and heavy, and then the figure appeared again. It stepped out of the darkness, its form now clearer, its outline glowing faintly in the moonlight. The shadows around it seemed to bend, to reach for the figure, as though it were made from the very darkness itself. The owner's pulse raced as they realized, with growing horror, that the figure wasn't just a person, it was something far older, something that had been bound to the land long before they had even set foot here. This was no simple treasure. This was a guardian. A force. A protector of something powerful. And they had disturbed it. The dog barked again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just a warning. It was a challenge. The dog leapt forward, moving faster than the owner had ever seen, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it raised one hand, and in that instant, everything froze. The dog stopped mid-air, suspended as though held by some invisible force. The owner felt the air in their lungs freeze, the weight of the situation settling like a heavy stone in their chest. The figure's voice, low and haunting, reached their ears once again. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said, its voice like a whisper in the wind. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The owner's eyes widened in terror as the figure slowly approached, its shadow growing longer, stretching out toward them. The object in their hand pulsed wildly now, as if trying to resist the force that was coming closer, but there was no escape. The tension in the air was unbearable. The figure's presence loomed large, and with every step it took, the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. What had they awakened? What had they unleashed into the world? The answers were slipping further away, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just an adventure anymore. This was a battle. And the stakes were far higher than they could have ever imagined. As the figure loomed closer, the owner's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The air around them was thick with tension, each breath feeling heavier than the last. The object in their hand pulsed again, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic beat that felt like a warning. But despite the growing sense of impending doom, something strange began to stir inside the owner. A strange sense of resolve. They couldn't explain it, but they knew they couldn't just stand there, frozen in fear. They had to do something, anything. The world around them seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Just as the figure raised its hand again, ready to unleash its dark power, there was a sudden crack. The earth beneath them seemed to tremble as the ground split open in front of them, sending a violent shockwave through the clearing. The owner stumbled back, but before they could regain their balance, something or someone emerged from the depths of the earth. It was another figure. But this one wasn't cloaked in shadow. Instead, it shimmered with an ethereal light, bright and vibrant, like the glow of 1,000 stars caught in one form. The contrast between the two figures was stark, as if they were polar opposites, tied to different forces of the universe. The new figure moved with a fluid grace, its presence exuding power, but there was something calming about it, something that stood in stark opposition to the darkness that had been chasing the owner. The figure that had been pursuing them froze. The shadows around it flickered, retreating into the corners of the clearing, as if afraid of the new presence. The air seemed to shift once more, the temperature cooling in a way that was almost refreshing. For a moment, the tension in the air lessened, though not by much. The owner stood in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the two figures, unsure of what they were witnessing. The shimmering figure spoke first, its voice soft yet undeniably powerful. "You have come too far," it said, its tone not threatening but more pleading. The balance must be maintained. The owner's heart was racing. There was so much they didn't understand, so many questions, but one thing was becoming clear: they were in the middle of something far bigger than they could have ever imagined. These two beings, one dark and malevolent, the other radiant and calm, were part of a larger struggle, a battle that had been going on long before the owner ever set foot in the forest. But before the owner could speak, the shadowed figure growled, a sound so guttural it felt like it came from deep within the earth itself. Balance? It hissed, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. There is no balance. There is only power. And it is mine. The glowing figure didn't flinch. Instead, it raised its hand, palm open, as if reaching out to the owner. The key you hold is not for you to wield, it said gently. You must return it. The power within it is far too great for anyone to control. It is not meant for mortals. The owner's hand tightened around the object. It was pulsing faster now, almost erratically, as if reacting to the conversation unfolding before them. The urgency of the situation was dawning on them. They were holding something far more powerful than they had ever realized. The object wasn't just some treasure, some lost artifact. It was a conduit. A key to something dangerous. Something the world might not be ready for. The shadows around them writhed again, and the dark figure let out a low, menacing laugh. Foolish, it spat. Do you truly believe this light can stop me? Do you think the balance is on your side? With a sudden, jerking motion, the dark figure lunged forward, the shadows swirling violently around it. But before it could get any closer, the radiant figure raised its hand once more, and the light surrounding it exploded outward in a blinding flash, pushing the dark figure back, forcing it into the trees, where it howled in fury. The clearing seemed to hold its breath. The dog barked furiously, pacing back and forth, as if sensing the enormity of what was happening. The owner, still standing frozen, couldn't move. They had never been so terrified in their life, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of awe, a deep recognition that they were caught in a moment that would change everything. The glowing figure turned back toward them, its gaze soft but filled with an urgency that made the owner's stomach twist. You must listen to me, it said. That object you carry, it is not just a treasure. It is a prison, a seal that holds back the very essence of darkness. Without it, the world will fall into chaos. The words sent a chill down the owner's spine. The object wasn't just valuable. It wasn't just a relic to be admired. It was a containment device, a prison for a power that could destroy everything. And now it was in their hands. They had unleashed it. They had broken the seal. The air around them seemed to thrum with energy, the atmosphere thick with an electric tension. The dog barked again, louder now, as though sensing the danger, his eyes wide with fear. The owner felt their heart race, their grip tightening around the object. There was no easy way out now. No simple solution. They couldn't return the object, not without facing whatever had been trapped inside it. What do I do? The owner whispered, almost to themselves, but the words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. The radiant figure stepped closer, its form glowing brighter. There is no easy path, it said, its voice filled with sorrow. You must choose. You must decide whether to hold on to it and risk everything, or give it back and trust that the balance will be restored. But know this: the darkness is already stirring. If you keep it, you unleash not just the figure before you, but others far worse. The figure pointed to the forest, to the dark trees that seemed to be closing in around them, as if they were part of something larger. The shadows in the distance seemed to move, swirling and gathering, a storm of dark energy waiting to break free. The decision was unbearable. The object in the owner's hand pulsed wildly now, almost as if it was alive, like a living thing, hungry for release. The dog's growls grew more frantic, and the owner felt the weight of the moment settle onto their shoulders. Whatever they chose, there was no turning back. The conflict had escalated beyond anything they could control, and they were standing at the center of it all. The radiant figure's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the gravity of its words. Make your choice, and do so quickly. Time is running out. The dark figure, still hidden in the trees, growled louder now, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground. The tension in the air became unbearable as the shadows seemed to close in, pressing tighter and tighter around them. The owner's pulse quickened. The moment of truth was here. But the choice was too overwhelming, and they knew that whatever decision they made, the consequences would be dire. The object pulsed again, louder this time, and in that moment, everything seemed to explode with an intensity that left no room for hesitation. The owner's mind raced, the weight of the decision pressing down with suffocating force. The object pulsed in their hand, almost as if it had a life of its own, calling to them. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the shadows shifting and curling like an ominous fog closing in. The dog was restless, pacing back and forth, its growls becoming more urgent, more desperate. The tension was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity. The radiant figure was watching them, its glowing form calm yet filled with an unmistakable urgency. "You must decide now," it urged, its voice a soft echo in the midst of the chaos. "There is no more time. The darkness will consume everything if you do not act." The owner felt the pulse of the object once more, almost as if it were a heartbeat, quick and frantic. It was clear now the object wasn't just the key to unlock a dark force, it was the key to controlling it, or perhaps even defeating it. But the question that gnawed at them wasn't what to do with the object, but whether they had the strength to face whatever came next. A loud growl broke the silence, snapping them from their thoughts. The shadowed figure moved again, its form shifting through the trees like a nightmare, its dark silhouette now unmistakably clear. It was coming closer, faster this time, its intentions no longer veiled in mystery. The forest trembled as the darkness surged toward them, and the owner knew they had no more time to think. They raised the object in their hand, the decision made, but as they did, something unexpected happened. The pulsing light from the object intensified, blinding in its brilliance. The shadows recoiled, writhing in pain, as if the light were burning them. The ground beneath the owner's feet cracked, and a low rumble filled the air, like the earth itself was trying to escape the forces that had been awakened. For a brief moment, it felt as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. The dark figure howled, but it wasn't the same victorious sound they had heard before. This time, it was a scream of pain, an agonized cry that sent chills down their spine. The shadows around the figure began to unravel, peeling back like the layers of an ancient, forgotten curse. The owner had no idea how they were doing it, but the object in their hand seemed to have a power far beyond anything they could comprehend. The radiant figure stepped forward again, its form growing brighter, its energy harmonizing with the light of the object. "You are doing it," it said, a note of awe in its voice. "The seal it is being reforged." But before the owner could respond, the ground beneath them shook once more violently this time, and the sky above darkened. The shimmering figure's voice grew frantic. "No, this is not what should have happened. You must." Before the figure could finish its sentence, there was a deafening crash, and the earth split wide open, sending a shockwave through the clearing. The radiant figure tried to shield them, but the force was too powerful. The object in the owner's hand trembled as the darkness surged forward once more, but this time, something was different. The shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to converge on the object itself, as if the darkness was feeding off it, growing stronger, more malevolent. And then, in a split second, the truth became clear. The object wasn't just a key. It wasn't just a prison. It was a trap. A trap designed to contain not only the darkness but the light as well. The glowing figure wasn't just trying to stop the darkness, it was part of it, part of the very force they had been fighting all along. The realization hit like a bolt of lightning. The radiant figure's form began to flicker, its glowing light dimming as the shadows consumed it from within. It was no longer a force of protection, but a harbinger of something far worse. The object had been the key to unlocking both the darkness and the light, and in doing so, it had brought them together, unleashing an even greater power than anyone had anticipated. The owner stumbled back, horrified, as the forest around them seemed to collapse into chaos. The dog barked frantically, its body shaking, its eyes wide with fear. The object in their hand now pulsed with an overwhelming energy, a force that was neither light nor dark but something far more dangerous. The dark figure let out a victorious laugh, its form no longer a twisted shadow but something more solid, more real. It was as if the boundaries between the two forces were blurring, becoming one. The air grew thick with energy, and the forest trembled beneath their feet. There was no escape. The owner's grip on the object loosened, but they knew it was too late. They couldn't undo what had been done. The dark figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire. "You thought you could control it," it said, its voice low and dangerous. "But you've only set it free." The balance was never meant to be maintained. It was meant to be broken. The owner's mind raced, the weight of their actions crushing them. There was no undoing the damage. The object had revealed its true purpose, an ancient device meant not to protect the world from darkness, but to release it. The force they had been fighting, the very essence of the forest's power, was not a battle between light and dark. It was the result of an endless cycle of creation and destruction. The key had been meant to unlock both forces, and now they were fully unleashed. But just as all hope seemed lost, the unexpected happened. The dog, still growling low, suddenly darted forward, jumping at the object in the owner's hand with a strength that surprised them. It wasn't a normal jump. It was as though the dog had tapped into something deeper, something primal, something that had been awakened within it. The dog's paws hit the object, and with a flash of light so bright it seemed to blind the entire forest, everything stopped. The shadows halted, the dark figure frozen in place. The light, too, seemed to falter, flickering as if it were on the verge of burning out. For a brief moment, everything was still. The dog, standing tall, its eyes now glowing with an ethereal light, looked up at the owner. It wasn't the same dog anymore. Something had changed, something beyond explanation. The owner's heart raced as they realized the final twist. The dog hadn't just been the companion in this adventure, it was the true key. The object, the forest, the forces of darkness and light, they had all been leading to this moment. The dog had been the one meant to control the power all along. It had been waiting for the right moment, the right person to bring it back to life. And as the forest around them seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the owner knew one thing for certain: they were no longer in control. The dog had become the new guardian, the true protector of the balance, a being not bound by light or darkness but something far more powerful, something that would guide the world through the storm they had unleashed. As the shadows receded, the light faded, and the silence that followed was profound. The dog, standing tall and unyielding, looked at the owner one last time, its eyes filled with ancient wisdom. And in that moment, the true adventure had only just begun. As the forest fell silent, the world around the owner and the dog seemed to pause, frozen in time. The shadows, once swirling and menacing, now withdrew into the depths of the trees, no longer threatening but distant, almost powerless. The light that had once felt so comforting, so radiant, now flickered weakly, as though it too was unsure of its place in this new world. The owner stood there, their breaths shallow, the object still in their hand, pulsing with a faint, steady rhythm. It was a strange comfort, but also a constant reminder of how close they had come to unleashing something far darker than they could have imagined. The dog, now standing tall and resolute, looked up at them, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was as though the very essence of the forest had entered into it, transforming the creature into something more than just a loyal companion. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The dog's fur seemed to shimmer with an ethereal glow, its posture strong and commanding. The owner's mind raced, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. It wasn't just that the dog had prevented the darkness from fully consuming them, it was more than that. The dog was now a guardian, a protector of this world, a force that had been awakened to balance the powers of light and darkness. The realization hit hard. The journey that had started as an innocent search for a treasure had become something much bigger. The dog had always been more than it seemed. The mysterious energy that had radiated from the object had drawn them both into this world, a world filled with ancient secrets and untold powers. The dog, it turned out, was not just a companion. It was the true key to restoring the balance. The shadows had retreated, but that didn't mean the danger was gone. The balance between light and dark had been disrupted, and it would take time to restore. But now, with the dog standing as the guardian, the forces that had once threatened to destroy everything were held at bay. The owner understood now that their role wasn't just to survive the adventure, it was to stand by the dog, to help guide it, and to witness the restoration of balance. The owner looked down at the object in their hand one last time. Its pulse had slowed, but it wasn't done yet. There was more to the object than they had initially realized. It wasn't just a weapon or a key, it was a reminder, a symbol of the responsibility they now held. The journey wasn't over. The forest, the dog, the power they had unleashed, it was all connected. And now, more than ever, they had to ensure that everything stayed in balance. As the dog gave a low, commanding bark, the forest began to stir. The air, once heavy and oppressive, now felt lighter. The ground beneath their feet felt solid again, and the trees that had once seemed to close in around them now stood tall and welcoming. The sky above, which had darkened during the confrontation, slowly began to clear, revealing the first rays of sunlight. The owner could feel a sense of peace returning to the world, but it wasn't the peace of a battle one, it was the peace of something far deeper. The world was healing, slowly but surely. And they were a part of that healing. They had been part of the journey all along, even if they hadn't fully understood their role until now. The dog, still standing firm, glanced back at the owner. There was a knowing look in its eyes, as though it understood the enormity of what had just happened. It wasn't just a companion anymore. It had become the protector of this world, the one who would stand between the forces of light and dark, ensuring that neither would overpower the other. The owner walked forward, taking a deep breath. The air felt fresher now, and as they passed by the trees, they could see the leaves swaying gently in the breeze, no longer burdened by the weight of the darkness. The forest was beginning to reclaim its natural beauty, slowly but surely. It would take time, but the restoration had begun. The dog followed closely behind, its steps quiet but purposeful. It was no longer just the curious creature that had started this journey with them. It was now a guardian, a guide, and a protector. Its eyes glowed with a soft light, a reminder of the power it now held and the responsibility it carried. The owner felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the dog. Without it, they would never have made it this far. The two of them walked together, side by side, knowing that the future was uncertain but hopeful. The forest, though scarred by the conflict, was beginning to heal. The balance had been restored, but it wasn't perfect. There were still remnants of darkness, still echoes of the chaos that had once threatened to consume them all. But with the dog as the guardian, they knew that the world had a chance. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over everything. It was a new beginning, a beginning that came with challenges, but also with hope. The dog looked up at the owner, its eyes filled with wisdom beyond its years, and for the first time in a long while, the owner felt a sense of peace. They had found the treasure, but it wasn't gold or jewels. It wasn't anything material at all. The true treasure was the bond they had forged with the dog, the understanding that came with realizing their place in the world. They had witnessed the power of light and darkness, and they had seen how fragile that balance could be. But they had also seen the strength of the bond between them and the dog, the unspoken connection that had guided them through the darkest moments of their journey. The dog stopped, its gaze fixed on something in the distance. The owner followed its line of sight and saw a small path that led deeper into the forest. It was a path they hadn't noticed before, one that seemed to beckon them forward. Without hesitation, the owner took a step toward the path, feeling the weight of the journey behind them, but also the promise of something new ahead. The dog, as always, stayed close, its glowing eyes watching over them, guiding them forward. And as they walked down the path together, the owner knew that their adventure was far from over. The balance would always need protecting, and there would always be new challenges to face. But they were no longer afraid. They had the dog. And with the dog, they could face anything. The forest had given them a gift, one that was not just about treasure or power, but about understanding. The owner now understood the importance of balance, of harmony between forces that seemed impossible to reconcile. They understood that the light and dark were not enemies, but two sides of the same coin, each necessary to the other. And they understood that sometimes, the most unexpected companions could hold the greatest power. As they continued down the path, the trees towering above them, the wind gently rustling the leaves, the owner felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they had experienced. They had come so far. And now, as they moved forward into the unknown, they knew that whatever came next, they were no longer alone. With the dog by their side, they would face whatever challenges awaited them. And the forest, though still carrying its scars, would continue to heal slowly, but surely under the watchful eyes of its new guardian. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure of all. The bond between them, the understanding they had gained, and the knowledge that they were not just survivors of an adventure, but protectors of something far greater.